Well, if I had to choose a hymn that would be the theme song of the series we are beginning, it would be just that hymn in relation to the book of Esther. This morning we're going to begin a interesting, hopefully exciting, worshipful, and above all God-honoring endeavor. We are going to begin for about the next 9 or 10 weeks or so, examine the Old Testament book of Esther. Now, you may wonder why I say that with such drama in my voice. It may not seem like a particularly surprising thing to do. I mean, after all, it's a book in the Bible, and I have been very upfront and honest with you that my goal in pastoring pastoring at Oakcrest is to preach through every book of the Bible in our time together on these years on earth. So it would stand to reason that we would come to Esther. But Esther is a very unique book of the Bible. It's probably, when it comes to what is called canonicity, the most controversial book of the Bible. Canonicity, the canon, is the corpus of books in the Bible. So from Genesis to Revelation, all of those books are called the canon. And whether or not books are included in the canon or excluded in the canon is a conversation that would take far longer than we have here together this morning. But needless to say, we believe through a very detailed process that the books that we have in the Bible are precisely the books that God desired to be there. It is not missing a book, and no book has been added that should not be there. Nevertheless, that does not mean that through the history of the church, there's not been controversy about which books should be in and which books should be out. And this is one of the most controversial for a number of reasons. Number one, just a series of questions for us to begin our look at this book, thinking about why is the name of God never mentioned in the book of Esther? You would think, I think logically so, that if it is in the Bible, and the Bible is God's story of Himself and our redemption, and pointing to His own glory and magnificence, His name would be there. And yet, it is not there for purposes that He certainly has overseen sovereignly. Why is prayer never specifically mentioned in the book? It is slightly alluded to a little bit, but never explicitly mentioned. Why does the New Testament never reference anything concerning the book of Esther, for that matter? The book of Esther gives us the historical basis for the Jewish feast of Purim. Now, that's important because the feast is established obviously before the New Testament, but the New Testament never makes reference to this feast. We could also look at more details, like the fact that the book concerns Jewish people living in a land that is not their own. They're still in this, they're not in the exile. They're choosing to remain there after they have been released to go to the promised land. But there's never in the book any mention of God's law. There's never any mention of Jerusalem or the Holy Land or returning there or anything to that extent. Now, come back to the issue of this idea of canonicity. I do not agree with the conclusions that were reached by a couple of the early reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. But I mention this just so you can have a little bit of insight into how controversial this book is. Luther actually made this comment regarding the book of Esther. He said, "I wish they did not exist at all, for they Judaize too much and have much heathen perverseness." So he obviously was not a fan of the book of Esther. And interestingly, for all of their writing, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of writing, Luther nor Calvin ever wrote a commentary on the book of Esther. They just kind of slide over it and ignore it. Nevertheless, I believe that they were very wrong in those assumptions that they made, because it is, in fact, the Word of God. Now, as to the content of the book of Esther, I think that you will also have a few surprises that you'll see as we go through this book. We're going to be faced with the issue of whether or not we can stereotype these characters and make the assumptions that we've always assumed, right? You've probably, regardless of how many times you've read the book of Esther or not read the book of Esther, if someone asked you, said, is Esther a good person or a bad person? You would probably say, oh, she's a wonderful person. Is Mordecai a good person or a bad person? Oh, he's a wonderful person. I think that as we're going to go through this book, we're going to have to ask the question of whether or not we can really understand these people as admirable people. And then through all of this, hopefully God will teach us something about who He is and who we are to be as His people. Now, before we begin to read, beginning in chapter 1, let me just set the context in terms of where we are in the Old Testament story. Where does Esther fit in the Old Testament narrative? Well, of course, we start at the beginning. Adam and Eve are created, and they have generations, and through those generations, the world devolves and spirals into deeper and deeper and more treacherous sinfulness, all the way, of course, until the time of Noah. We know the story of Noah being commanded by God to build the ark, taking his family into that ark. Meanwhile, all of those outside face the judgment of God through this deluge, this giant flood that kills all of humanity except for Noah and his extended family. Then, of course, we move forward from there through his descendant Shem. Then ultimately we have the birth of a man named Abram, and Abram is called by God. God enters into a covenant with Abram. Later he becomes Abraham. And through Abraham, all of the nations of the world will be blessed. And of course, we know that that is speaking of Jesus. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines, by which he has 12 sons all total. We read a little bit about that in regard to his favorite son, Joseph, just a moment ago in the book of Genesis. And of course, those 12 sons eventually, through all of this miraculous and providential things that happen through Joseph and his brothers, are all brought into Egypt under very good circumstances, very favorable circumstances. But of course, what happens? Eventually, there arises a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph, and the nation is in captivity, in bondage. They become slaves in Egypt. And they remain there for hundreds of years until God raises up another of His servants named Moses. He calls Moses to go and deliver the people of Israel from slavery. And we know the stories in regard to Pharaoh and the plagues. And ultimately, Pharaoh releases the people, and the people cross the Red Sea miraculously. And the sea falls in on all of Pharaoh's army. They are to go into the Promised Land, and of course they disobey and do not go into the Promised Land. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Finally, Moses is permitted to see the Promised Land, but not enter the Promised Land because of his own disobedience, and Moses dies. Immediately then God raises up a man named Joshua, and Joshua leads the people into the Promised Land and begins this era of conquest by which they are to possess their inheritance of the Promised Land. Eventually, of course, Joshua dies, and there's this period of judges, judge after judge after judge. Samson is probably the most well-known of those judges, and probably also one of the most morally ambiguous of them. Not really a hero again in Samson, but judge after judge after judge. And eventually, what do the people say? We want a king. All the nations around us have kings, and we want a king. And of course, the underlying message for us to take away is what? God would say, I am your king. And yet they want a human king. And so God permits. Saul is made king. Saul then, of course, has his own difficulties, ultimately is removed from the throne, and of course, great King David is on the throne. His son Solomon, at which point the kingdom is a unified kingdom at its largest geographic expanse that it would ever have. and after Solomon's death, the kingdom divides, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom composed primarily of the tribe of Judah, and which is the city of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in the north, prophets arise, Elijah, Elisha, probably the most well-known of those. And in the southern kingdom, other prophets arise, Jeremiah and Isaiah, probably the most well-known of those. And all of these prophets have basically the same message. You have been disobedient. You have gone after pagan gods. You have mistreated the oppressed and the poor among you. You have committed idolatry, and therefore you will be punished. The punishment comes to the northern kingdom in the year 722, when the Assyrian Empire completely obliterates the northern kingdom. They just conquer the northern kingdom. Then from 722 all the way to the year 586 BC, the only kingdom that remains, of course, is Judah. The Assyrian Empire falls, the Babylonian Empire rises, and it is under the Babylonian Empire that Jerusalem falls, the southern kingdom falls in 586. This begins a period known as the Babylonian captivity that had been prophesied by those very same prophets that Israel would go into exile, the Jewish people would go into exile under the captivity of a foreign people for 70 years. That happens just as God foretold it would happen until the Medo-Persian Empire overtakes the Babylonian Empire, and a king named Cyrus rises up, and Cyrus issues a decree by which the Jewish people are allowed to re-enter the land. The captivity is officially over at that point. But a number of Jewish people stay in the region of Babylon. Now, during the captivity is where we read about Daniel and his friends, of course. But after that, Cyrus's decree, many remain. It's not until many, many years later that we have the episode of Ezra and Nehemiah, by which they return, rebuild the temple, build the walls, and all that goes on with their ministries at that time. Right in between those two times, though, between the time of Cyrus's decree and the final aspect of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, you've got this window in which is the story of Esther. After Cyrus, a king named Darius arises. Darius dies eventually, and his son is the king that is discussed in the book of Esther. Now, in your English Bible, depending on what translation you're reading, the name will be different for this king. The Hebrew name is, as it reads in verse 1 of the ESV, Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. Now, the Persian name that maybe your Bible records is Xerxes. And so throughout this series, you will hear me use those names interchangeably. I'll either say Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Most often I will refer to him as Xerxes. Of course, this is the famous Xerxes that led the campaign against Greece that, of course, we will discuss even in this very first chapter. So that's where it fits, okay? So you've got the people of God, the Jewish people, living in a land not their home, living in a foreign kingdom, and you have a story about how God works miraculously, providentially in the lives of those people, and yet you never have reference to God. Why? Because God moves in a mysterious way. Let's begin reading in verse 1. The first thing we're going to read of is an elaborate empire. Let's look at the first 8 verses. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, just consider the expanse of that kingdom geographically, over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days, and when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women of the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So, we have this elaborate empire that is described. A grand pomp, elaborate, lavish decorations. And this time period is important. Notice when it says all of this takes place. This is in the 3rd year of his reign. He gave this feast. Now, this is important historically because that time period corresponds exactly to the time when Xerxes was building his war machine. He had an agenda, a very specific agenda that required a very large military. He was going to make war on Greece. And at that time, very much kind of a feudal system, he was dependent upon these other satraps and these other provinces to cooperate with him and to fund this mission to attack Greece. He needed their support. He needed their funding. He needed their manpower. And so he hosts this 6-month war council, basically, in which he's trying to impress these people that he's going to ask a big favor of, and that is to trust him and his kingdom to lead an attack into Greece. And so he's buttering up these people. He's showing how great he is. He's trying to show how great he is in this overwhelming abundance. Now, what's interesting about that, there is an ironic point that is lost on modern readers, because we don't know the history of the Medo-Persian Empire all that well. But when this book was originally written, something would have happened. Xerxes would have made his campaign into Greece and would return from that campaign with his head hanging low, humiliated, and with his vast empire of resources depleted to almost nothing. In other words, if you're the first reader reading the book of Esther and you read about how opulent and extravagant this king is living, you think, well, that's interesting because he's completely broke now, right? He has no money whatsoever, or at least not anywhere near what he had before the war effort. And so there's an irony, right? It is this trading places idea that we're going to see all the way through the story, right? Rags to riches, riches to rags, extreme swings in fortune, and what we might refer to as chance or fate, but we know is ultimately by the sovereign will of God. Verse 3, by the way, gives us a time period, 3rd year of the reign. That's 483 BC. That's 3 years before this famous campaign against the Greeks. So from the very beginning, there is a very definite man-centered worldview at work. Look at a couple of the verses that we read. Just think about the mood that is being communicated in these verses. For example, look at verse 4. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness. Now, if you didn't have any other context, you might think that was the Bible referring to who God is, right? And yet it's referring to a human king. And that's precisely the point. This is a very man-centered worldview. Xerxes wants people to think he is God. He thinks he is God. And so materialism and power are central in the whole story. And one of the theological themes that we're going to see in the book is a clash of worldviews. Now let me explain. What is a worldview? Well, it's just what the word implies. It is a way of viewing the world. When you see things going on around you, you process those events through a worldview. When you see something as simple as a sunset or a sunrise, you process that event through a worldview. You either have a natural, there are many worldviews, but we'll limit it to a very humanistic, naturalistic worldview, where you say, well, that is a planet, that is a star, and it puts off heat, and the world is rotating, and so it's just a natural phenomenon, nothing spectacular. When you see that from a Christian worldview, you also would acknowledge that the sun is a star, and it rises because of the rotation of the earth, but you would also quickly add, that is to the glory of God, and He has done this to reflect His own magnificence. You see, a worldview impacts how we do everything. Our worldview impacts what we do, what we don't do, how we spend our money, how we don't spend our money, where we go, what we say, how we live, everything. And so there are these two competing worldviews. Either the reality is that chance or fate or even a little bit of human accomplishment mixed in determine all things that come to pass, right? So we're in control of our lives unless it's a matter of fate or chance. That's one worldview that seems to be the surface worldview in the book of Esther. There's also another worldview, though, and that is that the providence of God, the sovereign will of God, determines all things that come to pass because He is in control. And this is despite whether or not people recognize it. So God is God, regardless of whether people want to acknowledge that He is God. God is sovereign in the universe, regardless of whether or not people recognize that He is sovereign in the universe. And so, it sets the stage for a very powerful king in His own eyes. So let's see what happens as the story continues to unfold. So we've seen an elaborate empire, and now we have this invitation ignored. We pick back up in a verse we ended with last time, verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So we have this next scene in the story, and the plot thickens. Now we have conflict in any good narrative, whether we're talking about fiction or nonfiction, real life or made-up stories. A problem develops. And here we've got the king surrounded by his trusted advisors. these eunuchs that serve him. By the way, they have such amazing names, don't they? I thought about naming our daughter Bigtha, but then I thought that might not be really good. But they're here, and they have an order from the king, this powerful king, who holds life and death in his hand. And he says, go and retrieve the queen so that I can, and it says in very clear terms, so I can show her off. She is the definition of a trophy queen, a trophy wife. He wants everyone to see her physical beauty. So there's a specific request on the part of the king that is denied by the queen. Look at verse 12 again. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. She just refused to come. There's a lot going on here. We have the first example here of what I referred to earlier as the moral ambiguity of the actions of the people in this story. What do I mean by that? Well, is what she did good or is what she did bad? First of all, we don't really have enough details to be able to make that judgment call, do we? There's a lot of questions regarding what is going on. First of all, why is she having her own banquet? Right? The text is clear. She also gave a feast for the women. So is that a sanctioned feast? Or if not, if she's doing her own banquet, she can't leave that banquet to come to another banquet. Well, why then why does she avoid coming before him when she's summoned? You know? Were things not going well? Maybe Vashti was opposed to the war effort. And her whole mentality is to try to avoid what he's doing, which is to build a military force. Maybe we're giving her too much credit altogether. And none of those things are the case. Question still remains, though, is she good? Is she bad? A lot of people reading this from the 21st century or maybe the 20th century read back and kind of read it through a filter that they impose on the text from kind of a women's liberation viewpoint and say, see, this is the first liberated woman. The husband says, come here, and she says, no, I won't. And they cheer her for that. She's done a good thing, right? Now, when this was written, though, do you think that people would have had a fond view of Vashti? Not at all. Especially men would not. But remember, the point is not even to think of her as the wife. She's the queen. It's not a matter of a husband and wife situation. It is a king and a queen situation. So is she to be commended for not coming to the king? Maybe she's making this noble gesture. Well, I'll not be displayed as an object. Right? Is she protesting his drunkenness? Right? Because, when does all this happen? According to verse 10, when he's merry with wine. Another qualifying consideration for context. Earlier, you remember when it talks about the drinks in verse 7, and then it says in verse 8, and drinking was according to this edict, there is no compulsion. Hey, read that and think, what does that even mean? At most formal banquets, you drank from your drink when the king commanded it to be done. And only then. It was a very, very bad thing. You didn't just sit with your drink and drink at your leisure. You did it when the king spoke and commanded it. What he does is a very lavish, elaborate gesture by removing that requirement. So now they're free to drink at will, whatever they want to do. Drinking, according to the historian Herodias, alcohol and drunkenness was a significant part of the culture in the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, when the king would gather his advisors and they were going to make major policy decisions. Now think about this. According to Herodias, factual, historical reality, they would, before they made any decision, they would get drunk. And then whatever idea they had in their drunken state, they would write it into policy. But then when they sobered up, they would re-examine the issue, and if it still seemed like a good idea, they would go forward with it. Now, here's something even stranger. If they were sober when they came to a decision, they would wait until they were drunk, and if it still seemed like a good idea, they would follow through with the decision. Drunkenness is rampant in this situation, and so that has to come into play at some level. Maybe Vashti now is making a moral stand on that purpose. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but maybe it's the flip side. Maybe it is that she's denying the headship of this king. Whatever we want to say about her, she is brave and she is determined. But why am I making all of these points? Here's what I want you to see. Here's the main point from this section that I want you to take away. We cannot read the book of Esther as trying to determine whether this person is positive or negative, whether this person is good or bad. If we do that, we miss the point of what God is communicating. There is a theory of interpretation called the exemplary model. And for years and years, maybe you've heard this preached this way. If you've heard Esther preached formally, you've heard it preached as Esther is the example of a godly woman, so be like Esther, right? Or you might take away something like, for such a time as this, right? Be brave like Esther, as we'll see later in the story. Or be noble like Mordecai. Or don't connive and scheme like Haman. If we leave it at that, we miss it, because here's the thing. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a fable with a moral point. Trying to discern that is messier than we might think. Because what is the reality of life? Divine providence works through human behavior that often has mixed motives and evil motives. What is human nature? Why do we do the things that we do? If we try to determine, is it totally good or totally bad? We know we can't, because it's messier than that, right? There's mixed motives. And so King Xerxes does what he does for selfish reasons. Vashti does what she does for various reasons. And we'll see this all throughout the story. Now notice how this first chapter concludes. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshna, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom, according to the law, that what is to be done to Queen Vashti. So they've got a moral dilemma here, right? What do we do with this blatant, disobedient queen? Because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, delivered by the eunuchs. And Memucan said, in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to come before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who will have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, Let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And so when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. So we have this elaborate empire and an invitation that is ignored, and now a drastic decree. From here in the first chapter, and we're going to see this all the way through, a huge emphasis is placed on these royal decrees, right? And something that is consistent throughout Scripture, not just the book of Esther, is this idea that when a Persian king makes a decree, it is irrevocable. It cannot be repealed. It has to go forward regardless of whether it is proven to be good and logical later on down the line. If it's said, it has to go forward, right? And so we're going to see that in the remainder of the book. It becomes very important in the plot of the story of Esther. Now, verse 16 tells us that it is the suggestion of this advisor, Memucan. And his answer seems to be most concerned with gaining the approval of the king, right? And this is no surprise, politically speaking. He is saying what the king wanted to hear. But let me ask you, do you think that it really would have happened as he says it would happen? I mean, is this really going to be known by every woman in the entire empire? Remember, it extends from India to northern Africa. A massive expanse. And as this text tells us, it's different languages, different peoples. And so do you think what happened at this party at the king's palace is really going to become known to every woman in the world and cause this huge marital upheaval? I think that would be a little far-fetched. Would wives all over the kingdom have instantly stood up to their husbands and demanded change? And when you think about it from that respect, it's almost comical. It's almost a little bit of comic relief in the story, because by issuing this elaborate decree and making it go throughout all of the empire, what does he do? He only serves to publicly broadcast the humiliation of his queen not coming to him as he requested, right? So he publicizes something that otherwise would likely be completely unknown. Nobody would ever even know the difference. And yet, because of his own self-centeredness and his own fixation with his own power, he makes this decree. And it is a drastic decree. And the ultimate irony of this decree is just how weak it really is. What it actually accomplishes is very little, right? Vashti is not to come before him again. Look at verse 20. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands. This is just an ego boost for the king and his advisors. They want to feel like they're doing something significant. He acts out of a decree, a fit of rage. This decree is out of a fit of rage. But here's the question that we'll see throughout this whole story. Who's really in charge? God. All of this is unfolding for purposes that God has in store. Why? What will this decree directly lead to? the discovery of Esther and the rise of Esther in prominence in the sight of the king and ultimately in the kingdom. So all of these events are happening in such a way that God's plan is unfolding. Here's the simple and yet profoundly important point of all of this as we close our time. What we do, the decisions you make, the lives that you live, like ripples in a pond, have far-reaching consequences beyond anything that we could ever imagine. Even in these seemingly evil and self-centered actions of the king and the politicians and his advisors, God is moving. God is unfolding all of history to an end that is to the glory of His own name and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so what we'll see piece by piece as the pieces of the puzzle come together is to see how things that seem to be insignificant on the front end prove to be extremely significant in the outworking of God's plan. And the fact that God is not mentioned anywhere in what we've read so far or what we will read to come just emphasizes the reality that God is God, whether you acknowledge it or not. What our responsibility is to live lives of obedient submission to the God who has granted us forgiveness and eternal life through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Would you stand with me as we sing a hymn of response at this time? Father, we thank You for Your sovereign action in all things. And it is true that You move in a mysterious way. And we have no idea how simple actions and decisions that we make today, according to Your will, You will use and weave together in a beautiful tapestry to Your own glory and honor. We ask this and pray it all in Jesus' name.